I've always struggled with world building. I never know how much to build, where to stop, or what's actually gonna matter to my players. So I asked two of the best world builders I know, the creators of the wildly successful Emmy award-winning Drakenheim setting, Monty and Kelly of the Dungeon Dudes.
My name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin,
and we are the Dungeon Dudes.
You can only get this on my channel now because apparently they don't do that on theirs anymore. But when I asked what they had learned from writing the Drakenheim books that could help home GMs, their answer really surprised me. Not just because it taught me something new, but because it sounded way easier than whatever I was doing. It's like taking a peek at Gandalf's spellbook and realizing it's just 4 sticky notes and a Trader Joe's receipt. According to the Dungeon Dudes, the real key to good world building is doing less of it. They shared a ton of great tips about how to figure out which world building to skip and which is gonna pay off at the table.
And it makes your world feel vast, mysterious, and like ever-growing and weirdly credible. Like it's weird how this idea of doing less work makes your world feel bigger.
So here are the 3 things you're probably overdoing and why letting go of them will make your life easier and your campaign better.
A lot of people when they're starting to play D&D will pick up an adventure book and they're like, well, I want to write my own and I need to write something that looks and feels like an adventure book. And that is just like, that is so not true, and you should not learn that lesson. You should not think that you need to write as much as is in any of the adventure books that you've seen.
Going into this interview, I thought, who better to teach world building than the guys who built the world of Drakenheim? It's the setting for their 7-year actual play show, which just ended a few weeks ago with over 200 episodes, some of which I'm in. But don't let that scare you off, it's a great show. They've published 3 Drakenheim books, a campaign book, a setting guide, and a monster book, raising over $3 million on Kickstarter between them. Weaker men would have stolen that money to fund a mad scientist laboratory and make real monsters. It's me, I'm Weaker Men. But even though the world of Drakenheim is polished and complete and probably in use at thousands of tables across the world, it's actually the pre-publication version of Drakenheim that Monty and Kelly told me game masters should be learning from. The version that looks less like a refined, expertly made tome and more like something you'd find crumpled in the bottom of Gandalf's laundry basket.
The fact is that when we wrote Dungeons of Drakenheim, we were taking our notes, or Monty's notes, from running the actual play and turning them into a book. And we had to write about 10 to 15 times as much to make it into a functioning adventure book. You actually have to do maybe 10% of the work that you actually see in an adventure book. You just need enough prompts for you as the DM to understand how to bring it to life at the table.
And I would say that every GM is going to find their own level. Like, so I've played with and been the DM that was like, 1% of a book is enough for me to run a game. Some people need maybe 25%.
Of course, I figured that the book had more padding and polish than Monty's original notes, but the sheer scale difference that they're describing here really took me aback. 10 to 15 times as much content is pretty wild. If I look at a setting book and think, I need to create all this to run my game, I immediately panic. You might as well ask me to recite the Silmarillion from memory. But 10% or even 25% is a heck of a lot more manageable. That's like 1 appendix of the Silmarillion. I've talked about this before on this channel, but I do not consider myself much of a world builder. I know that there are people out there who really thrive on creating continents and dynasties and long-reaching political histories, the Tolkiens and George R.R. Martins of the world, lovingly crafting lore that could crush a lesser mortal beneath the sheer weight of its pages. And that's just never been me. I really enjoy creating small pockets of a world, like a particular town or shop or forest, but whenever I try to create anything bigger than that, I just get overwhelmed and kind of give up. So hearing Monty and Kelly say that I don't need to be a Tolkien-esque lore factory to build a functional world honestly made me wonder if maybe there is a world builder inside me somewhere. A small, nervous one, like a blink dachshund. They can teleport and they're anxious about it.
I'll tell many dungeon masters that are running Dungeons of Drakenheim, what you're holding in your hands in that book is an order of magnitude more material than I had when I originally ran the campaign. And I say that to remind dungeon masters that are running Dungeons of Drakenheim for themselves that you don't need something written on the page that deals with every single eventuality, and that you should feel empowered to use your judgment in the moment.
I think especially when a setting book is based on an actual play, it's easy for viewers to feel like in order to run a game like the one they see on camera, they need all the same information that's printed in the book. So I thought this was a great reminder that a lot of things only ended up in the book because players got interested in them.
Some of the most canonical fixed elements of the world of Drakenheim were things that were kind of invented on a whim in the midst of play, and then became fixed because they were on a show and then got written into a book and then became what they are. But the only way to find out what things are fixed and what things are malleable is what actually happens at your game table.
That's the part I think we sometimes forget. A setting book is a reference, not a to-do list. It's there so that when something does come up in play, you have something to pull from. But if we peeked into every home Drakenheim campaign, I'm pretty sure we'd see one GM who's memorized the politics, one GM who's skipped the politics in favor of introducing a sexy, romanceable eldritch abomination, and one GM who's forgotten most of the lore and is just running on vibes. The problem with using a setting book as a guideline for your own home game world building is that your goals are different. A book has to go into thousands of hands and work for thousands of tables, everyone from the ultra planners to the agents of chaos who are horny for abominations. It has to serve near infinite GM styles, but your home game prep only needs to serve you. Plus, Monty says he thinks building out less of your world can actually make that world easier to play in.
I find that if you do a lot of prep, you can actually ossify elements of your world and make it more difficult to engage with because you've fixed something in your mind that it has to be this way.
At this point, you might be saying, Ginny, if we aren't supposed to use setting books as a guide, then how are we supposed to know what to prep? And that is a great question, which I am excited to dig into right after today's sponsor, me. That's right, I'm putting my own ad into my own video, and no one can stop me. Need a friend to dungeon crawl with? Now you can quest with me all year long with the brand new Dungeon Dolls 2026 wall calendar. Wow, it's 13 magical months, including a bonus month for January 2027, because who doesn't want a little extra adventure? Each month features a dungeon doll ready to play, designed with the amazing artists at Little Giant Studio. Look, this one even has her own Valiant Steed, sold separately. You can get the classic calendar or upgrade to the deluxe bundle for even more fun. A full set of pink glittery dice and a booklet of 4 doll-inspired subclasses for 5e. Or grab the digital calendar so you can bring Dungeon Doll magic to every device you're attuned to. Dungeon Dolls 2026 is available for pre-order right now and ships in December, perfect for holiday surprises or rewarding yourself after a long year of racking up exhaustion levels. It's limited edition, so once it's sold out, it's gone forever. Don't wait for a long rest to grab yours. Collect the whole party at ginnyd.com/shop. Recommended for ages 8 and up and levels 5 and higher. Use only as directed or recklessly for advantage on your next attack. So if we're not supposed to use setting books as guides for world building, what should we be following? I asked Monty and Kelly, and they mentioned something that you already have right there at your table. That's right, it's 2 empty cans of Celsius and a half-eaten bag of gummy worms. Just kidding, it's your players.
Where do your players come from? Right? What classes are they, and what are the things that your players need to launch from?
But if you have a general idea of the types of gods that are in your setting, you don't need to write down all of the detail. You might even write down 3 or 4 names of gods. The end. Then you find out in session 0 that one of your players is playing a cleric, and they're like, hey, what sort of gods can I connect to? That's when you sit down with the cleric and you're like, okay, I got this idea for these 4 gods. We could make up a whole new one. What are you looking for?
Okay, my player really likes thunder gods. I wasn't thinking about a thunder god, but maybe let your player make up that religion.
Yeah.
My player's playing a wizard. I didn't really think I needed a magical academy, but now I need one. And so if you got 5 players, the 5 things that you should start off with world building are like a couple things that your players can use to anchor themselves in the world.
I actually love this as a kind of world building hack. If nothing else, just create one element of your world that aligns with each player character. So if you have a rogue who's part of a thieves guild, you build that thieves guild. If you have a character with a noble background, you flesh out that noble house. If you have a warlock whose patron is mysterious and unknowable, you're good. take the night off. It's basically a ready-made checklist of world-building elements that you can be almost certain will come up in play. You can also flip this on its head to spot things that you probably shouldn't be spending time on. If you're lovingly crafting a thieves guild, but none of your characters are criminals and there's no quest hook pointing at crime, you're almost definitely over-prepping. At most, jot down a name like the Velvet Daggers and move on with your life. If down the line your players loot something extremely valuable and extremely illegal and start asking, so, who buys dragon eggs around here? That's your cue to give that thieves guild a little more detail. But until then, the Velvet Daggers shouldn't be more than a napkin note, or the name of your new glam goth bardcore band. In short, you only need to build what your players touch. Everything else can stay in the quantum fog until they decide to poke it.
There's this phrase, and so many people have repeated it, so I can't take any credit for it, but it's like, you only need to be one session ahead of your players.
I love this phrase, one session ahead of your players. That might sound more like a prep tip than a world building tip, but those two things are actually way more intertwined than you might think. I used to think that world building happened right up front, before the game even started, and then prep just meant figuring out what happens in that world from session to session. In my head, it was a clear pipeline. Step 1, invent continent. Step 2, panic. Step 3, stop crying long enough to run a game. But in reality, world building is happening continuously as you play.
We're talking a lot about world building, and in that phrase itself, it implies that you are building an entire world.
I think the map is a really powerful tool just in general for world building. Not necessarily thinking that you need to build the map of the entire world. Like, reduce the scale. Don't do your entire globe, an entire planet. Grab, like, something the size of a single US state. And that would be the largest I would start with in terms of a geographical area.
Monty and Kelly advise building the starting area and then not worrying too much about what's outside of it until players start sniffing around. You can give other locations names and maybe even cardinal directions or short descriptors, but you don't really need more than that until you get the idea that your players will want to pay it a visit.
Naming places and saying like one paragraph about them is more than enough. And you don't have to do that again in your home game. You can literally name the desert. And if your players decide, if they ask like, hey, what's in that desert? You can be like, well, there was once a group of druids rumored to live there that were like desert druids. And they're like, cool, we're not gonna go there. See
And then if they're like, I want to go meet the desert druids, then you can build it.
then you worry
Build
about who the hell the
druids.
desert druids are.
Yeah.
There is a good chance that they will never visit the desert, and then you'll be glad you didn't spend a ton of hours creating a whole desert druid society that no one's ever gonna meet.
I wanted to make the wider world as boring as possible so my players wouldn't go there, and the focus would be, I could put 100% of my energy into Drakenheim itself, making it the most interesting place. That failed, and when it became apparent that through the course of the campaign, in role-playing NPCs and role-playing interactions and upping the stakes of the conflict, I started dropping hints about what the wider world was, and our audience and our players got fascinated with what was happening, because it's kind of that rule of like, as soon as you say you can't go there, you can't touch that, it makes people want to know more about it.
What I love about this is that not only does it reduce the amount of work you have to do and avoid the problem of putting a ton of effort into creating a location that your party never visits or a bit of history that your party never learns, but it also allows you to literally shape the world around what your players are into. When I asked my Patreon members what their biggest pain points were when world building, quite a few of them mentioned not knowing how to get players to care about the world they've built. But what if that's backwards? Instead, what if you identify what parts of your world your players care about and then develop those? If you keep the world loose and undefined until the players interact with it, then your players' interests literally sculpt the world. You might think they'll be into your spooky coastal ghost town, the Whispering Docks, but if you drop a line or two about it and nobody bites, no harm, no foul. They're gonna be way more engaged when they decide to go visit the Toad Market, because whether they realize it or not, they chose it by showing interest in it. It's collaborative storytelling, and it's also being lazy. The greatest trick a game master ever pulled. Now, as a recovering perfectionist myself, I was not surprised to hear Monty and Kelly talk about perfection as the enemy of world building. A weekly YouTube upload schedule has pretty much cured me of any delusions I might have once had about achieving perfection. At this point, I consider it a win if I make it through with both my eyelashes still on. But it turns out they meant something totally different from what I expected. I assumed they meant, don't expect yourself to be perfect, you will make mistakes, and that's okay. Which, yeah, obviously, if perfection were a requirement for being a game master, D&D would not have survived 5.5 editions. But they actually had a completely different angle on this that really changed the way I think about world building.
Especially when it comes to things like cosmology, pantheons, gods, and the history of your world. I think that oftentimes we take the wrong lessons from fantasy in our world building and don't learn enough from the real world. If we look at, the example of world building, Tolkien, who has a very specific pantheon, the world has a very specific creation myth, and it all stems through from that. A lot of the lessons that we sometimes take from that is that that's the way that it has to be. But the real world is filled with myriad pantheons, religions, gods, beliefs, and countless creation myths. Yeah. And for me, I find that a setting that does not have a single coherent creation myth is more credible to me. A lot of the really prominent examples of world building that the Dungeons and Dragons books give us, the core rule books, are very ordered and highly structured worlds. I always like to say it's super ironic that the Great Wheel has a chaos quarter in it. That chaos is like
it's gonna stay in
neatly
its
sorted.
place.
And as someone who loves eldritch horror and cosmic horror, I build my worlds based on cosmic chaos. Like, I love the unknowable. I love the fact that mortals especially don't understand everything about their world. And I find that that's a very freeing thing for me world building, because if the people that inhabit your world don't actually know what really happened 10,000 years ago.
I think this is such an important thing to remember as a game master. We often feel like we need some kind of omniscient command of our world at all times, just in case a player suddenly asks, so who invented boats? But the truth is, players have no access to a real, reliable authority. Every NPC, every dusty old tome they encounter in the game is potentially and delightfully unreliable. Just like our real-world historians, NPCs are probably just doing their best with whatever rumors survived the years. Who invented boats? I don't know, probably the first guy who got tired of swimming. How should I know? That means we don't actually have to lock in some official universal truth. We can decide later, or never.
What the takeaway of this for anybody building their own world is that you can actually get your own history wrong at the table, and your players are like, this NPC just told us that the war was won by this side 100 years ago, but we heard from the other PC that it was the other side. I'm like, oh wow, that never happens in the real world. Like the history is so convoluted and messy that the fact is that you can get your own history so wrong at the table.
It's actually very freeing as a DM when you embrace this idea of embracing contradiction, embracing the mess, embracing the unknown in your world, because for me, again, it comes back to the real world feels that way. Historians will tell you that we can argue over what happened 100 years ago very, very easily. And yeah, sure, we don't have elves that live 1,000 years in our world, that maybe it would be a little bit simpler. But I do think that there's more lessons to take from the real world than a lot of what we look to in fantasy worlds. And it makes your world feel vast, mysterious, and ever growing and weirdly credible. It's weird how this idea of doing less work makes your world feel bigger.
I love this idea that a messy, sometimes conflicting world actually feels more real and complex. We can give ourselves permission to have a looser grasp of our world's history and events, not just because it's easier, but because it'll actually make that world more three-dimensional. And you don't have to admit to this either. If your players spot an inconsistency in your lore, you can just nod solemnly and say, yes, fascinating. Clearly the scholars disagree.
Yeah. And a lot of people don't necessarily like to hear that. They like to imagine that Monty and I have this grand scale knowledge of all of the secrets of our universe. But most of the secrets of our universe are actually still secrets to us. We just need to figure out what they are.
And that can be true for a home DM too. Your players can believe you have these grand secrets of the universe floating around in your head, even if you don't.
Yeah.
There's another way in which perfection can be a problem for world building. And if you've ever heard Monty talk about world building before, you've probably heard it.
The biggest fantasy is that the players get to affect the world. And once again, in our real lives, we often feel very powerless about the state of the world. And so I think the power fantasy of D&D in particular and role-playing games is that you do get to be the hero who changes the world and affects the world, and in very dramatic and profound ways. Yeah. And so I do think that presenting your players with a world of problems that they can solve is really exciting. And I would say a pitfall to run into is sometimes you get building your world and it is built around a world that you would love to live in.
You have this line that I've heard you say a lot
Yeah.
about your world. Do you want to say it?
Your world will look better on fire.
Yay.
Yeah.
It's a great line.
Yeah.
What he's talking about is, on a fundamental level, conflict. We all know that a story needs conflict to be compelling. Without it, your campaign is just a very elaborate walking tour with occasional dice rolls. But he's also talking about something bigger here. Not just add a villain or throw in a problem, but build a world that actually needs your players. And better yet, a world that your party won't just rescue, but can actually meaningfully change.
Oftentimes, fantasy stories have this sort of thing where it's almost like about a return to status quo.
Yeah.
And fantasy stories can be actually quite traditional and conservative in that respect, where the past is idealized as the grand state, and that we must restore the monarchy, we must restore the order, everything, like things must go back to the way they were because the villain has thrown it into chaos.
You need to be able to create a problem that the world that you've created can't easily solve, and that the players need to be the tipping point for the issues that you're going to tell in your story.
So when we talk about perfection being the enemy of world building, that doesn't just apply to your expectations for yourself and the level of detail and consistency in your lore. It applies to the world itself too. If your players are supposed to be heroes, then you need to create a world that's broken enough to make them matter. If everything's running smoothly, your party is basically just a group of very well-armed tourists. But if the world is on fire, suddenly your players have purpose. You might even say they have a reason to be carrying that sword. So that's the big takeaway. You're not just allowed to do less world building, it actually makes your campaign better. When you stop trying to pin down every corner of the map or codify every piece of lore, your world becomes more responsive to the story you and your players are telling. Your prep becomes lighter and more flexible, your world becomes more reactive and surprising, and your players get more invested because they can actually see their fingerprints on it. Honestly, hearing all this made me want to take another stab at a homebrew world. Or at least a toad market. That sounds sick. If you want to hear more advice from Monty and Kelly, check out the Dungeon Dudes channel. They have tons of great videos for game masters and players, and of course their Drakenheim actual play show is fantastic if you're looking for 200 or so episodes to binge. And don't forget, you can pre-order the Dungeon Dolls 2026 calendar right now. It's 13 months of dungeon crawling glamour, just absolutely drenched in nostalgic 90s toy aesthetic. Treat yourself, treat a friend, treat someone who desperately needs more pink glitter in their life.